Hello there. This is Dan Gardner, and on behalf of the Los Angeles-based supply chain consulting company Trade Facilitators Incorporated, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar entitled The Bullwhip Effect for U.S. Importers: How Amplified Demand Signals, Untested Assumptions, and Time Lags Conspire to Bloat Inventories. We will note the title says U.S. importers, but the concepts we're going to talk about today are applicable to importers anywhere in the world. We just happen to be using the perspective of the U.S. importer. We only have 10 slides today, so there's not going to be too much wasting of time. Let's see what we have for an agenda. First, we'll get into the origins and definition of the bullwhip effect, and as we'll see in a moment, it does have a rich history. It's been around for quite some time. We'll talk about a classic bullwhip effect simulation. It's a training tool, a software tool that companies and universities use to illustrate the effects of the bullwhip effect. It's called the bear game. You might be familiar with that. And then we'll jump into why import supply chains are susceptible to the bullwhip effect, based mainly on the nature of import models themselves, outsourced manufacturing, build to order production, but also amplified demand signals, feedback loops, and cumulative lead times. If you're not familiar with some of these terms or all of them, don't worry, we'll define them quickly as we advance through the slides. And then we'll talk about best practices to avoid bloated import inventories. Okay, let's look at the origins and definition of the bullwhip effect. This phenomenon that eventually came to be known as the bullwhip effect was first conceptualized by Dr. Jay Forrester of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This is Jay Forrester over here in a picture from the 1950s. But he first described this phenomenon. He didn't call it the bullwhip effect. Urban legend has it that Procter & Gamble actually coined the term, but he described it in detail. He is the father of the bullwhip effect, as well as the school of systems thinking, actually, which we'll talk about that more in just a bit. But he described the bullwhip effect in his book, Industrial Dynamics. One thing we'll say is that there are different iterations of the bullwhip effect. Given the shortness of this webinar, we're going to look at how the bullwhip effect amplifies or bloats inventory levels, but we will acknowledge there are different iterations, different versions of the bullwhip effect. But in general, as we see in our second bullet point, excuse me, the bullwhip effect describes scenarios where inventory levels across a supply chain become misaligned with demand. And that could be demand is going up, demand is going down, due to the convergence of factors that include the amplification of demand signals, untested assumptions, and time lags. Again, we'll describe those in just a bit, but the whole systems thinking school of thought, and especially this idea of the bullwhip effect, focuses on the unwarranted amplification of demand signals, that demand is being presented in a way that doesn't reflect actual demand. It's being amplified. Untested assumptions, we all know what those are, and time lags. As a quick note, because we are treating this subject rather quickly, for a full discussion on systems thinking and supply chain management, view the TFI video of the same name that's found on this same YouTube channel. But everything we're talking about is based on systems thinking and the concepts put forth originally by Dr. Forrester, in this instance, the bullwhip effect. The best way to define the bullwhip effect is to describe how it works through the bear game. And again, the bear game is a software simulation that is used by universities, companies for training, that tells a cautionary tale of how inventories can become bloated. That's what we see here, inventory bloat, not only in one place in the supply chain, but all across a supply chain. This particular version of the bear game, I put forth in a white paper that I published earlier in 2021, March of 2021. So it's an updated version of the bear game. And it's, as I said, a cautionary tale about inventory bloat, but the protagonists in our tale of woe are a liquor store owner, a beer distributor from whom the liquor store gets its beer and other liquors, and a craft brewery. Of course, it also involves, although they were entirely ignored through the entire exercise, the people that actually buy the beer, that go into the liquor store and make purchases. But as an updated version of the beer game, I described it in such a way that these three players didn't understand demand signals for a variety of reasons. But what the liquor store owner saw was that beer sales for a particular craft beer was up. What the liquor store owner didn't know was that a local rock band put together a YouTube video in an unsolicited fashion. They had no agreement with the craft brewer, where they were partying up a storm in a music video and drinking that particular brand of craft beer. It was an unsolicited product placement at the end of the day. But YouTube and social media being what it is, people saw the beer in the video and said, "Oh, this looks good," and they started buying more and more of the beer. The liquor store owner, clearly an absentee manager, never bothered to ask customers why more beer was being purchased. As the beer sales increased, when the beer distributor, the sales rep for the beer distributor, would come in on a weekly basis to take their orders, the liquor store owner started ordering more of this particular craft beer. Beer sales are up, we need more beer. Under normal circumstances, there was a 2-week lead time for an order to be received and then delivered to the liquor store. But now the liquor store is placing larger orders on the beer distributor. The beer distributor, in passing, says to the liquor store owner, "You know, this beer is selling really well. A bunch of my other customers, other liquor store owners, are buying more also. Maybe you should order even more." And we start to see how that demand signal becomes amplified, distorted, if you will. Now the beer distributor shows up with a bunch of larger orders at the craft beer brewer, who's just that, a craft beer brewer, and doesn't have a lot of production capacity to make the beer to meet all of these orders. So what happens? There are backlogs, back orders are placed. So the lead time isn't 2 weeks now, it's 4 weeks, it's 6 weeks, because as beer sales continue, people are still watching the video, partying up, the backlogs continue to grow. Like anything on social media, people's attention span starts to dissipate, and beer sales for this particular brand start to flatten over time. That's a pretty cheesy joke. Nobody likes flat beer, you get it? But we have to inject a little bit of humor in here. But what's going on is there are time delays in the delivery of these beers because of the beer, I should say, because of these backlogs. And over time, a period of weeks and months, beer sales start to flatten. But now the beer is getting produced weeks later and starts to be delivered. But now the beer isn't selling anymore. So the liquor store owner gets stuck with inventory that he or she doesn't want and probably has to discount the price and lose money just to get rid of it. Same for the beer distributor, same for the craft brewer. That is an example of the bullwhip effect. What drives this bullwhip effect? Well, there are key dynamics here. Number one, misunderstood demand signals, or in this case, totally ignored demand signals, because no one stopped to inquire as to why the beer sales were going up. Obviously, there was a lack of communication between the liquor store, the beer distributor, and the craft brewer. They were just placing orders and doing their thing. Bogus assumptions. The questioning of assumptions is a big part of that school of systems thinking, but there was no questioning of assumptions here. Two of the big assumptions were that beer sales would continue to go up and stay up into perpetuity. And another big assumption was that the brewer could handle all of these larger orders. They're a craft brewer. They can't make that much. They just couldn't handle the order. So there are two big assumptions that blew up in the supply chain. Another tenet of systems thinking is what's referred to as a countervailing force, essentially a constraint in the supply chain. A constraint being that production capacity of the brewer and the minimum under normal conditions of a 2-week lead time to receive a normal beer order, which got blown up even further because of the backlogs experienced by the brewer. A big component, and we'll see this when we talk about it in an import environment, there's a time lag between decisions and actual outcomes. The decision to order more beer, and when the beer actually gets brewed and delivered. These time delays here, a time lag. Super important point, the time lag between a decision being made and the actual outcome. A big part of systems thinking is this whole concept of feedback loops. And again, there's a whole video on the TFI YouTube channel that talks about systems thinking and explains feedback loops in detail. We're not going to do that here, but a feedback loop essentially is made up of behaviors, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, that reinforce an outcome, that create, in this instance, a vicious cycle or a self-fulfilling prophecy of inventory bloat. As systems thinkers, we're always looking at feedback loops, and of course, the amplification of demand signals. That is a good classic example of the bullwhip effect. Super simplified, I might add. And as we see when we talk about an international supply chain, things can get really crazy just by virtue of the fact that there were so many more players in an import supply chain. As a quick reminder, this description of the beer grain, this image was actually taken from the white paper that I wrote on this subject, the application of systems thinking to global supply chain management, which is available for free. You don't even have to register. We're not interested in people's names and addresses and contact information. We're just interested in sharing. So go to the site, you can download this paper for free. It's an intense depiction of supply chain and systems thinking. So what happens here? The supply chain responds to feedback loops, those behaviors that create sometimes virtuous, but many times vicious cycles and self-fulfilling prophecies, in this case of a bloated inventory, the bullwhip effect. Well, we have over here the actual product demand, and you can see why it's called the bullwhip effect, because there's an amplification of demand for a lot of different reasons, but amplified demand quantities created by the retailer, beer distributor, and craft brewery based on that lack of communication, not talking to customers, making bogus assumptions, not thinking about the time lags. This is the bullwhip effect. Moving on, why import supply chains are susceptible to the bullwhip effect. And a lot of it has to do with behavior of the supply chain players, but also the very nature of import supply chains. The countervailing forces, the innate constraints that exist in an import supply chain will contribute to the bullwhip effect. Let's look at some of these characteristics. Much unlike our previous example with 4 players, the average import supply chain is made up of 15 or more arm's length participants, meaning there's a bunch of different companies involved that are all working together to get product into the hand of a customer, but they're also pursuing their own goals, many times profit-oriented goals. These are arm's length players. Consistent with that idea of an arm's length player, most importers outsource their production to overseas suppliers, to overseas vendors for hundreds, if not thousands, of items. It's not unusual for good-sized importers that do 500 million, a billion, or more a year to be working with hundreds, 300, 400, 500 active vendors. That's fertile ground for information to get amplified, for demand signals to get amplified, for buyers to panic. It's the nature of the model itself that encourages the bullwhip effect. That's called a countervailing force in the world of systems thinking. Another point about this outsourced production model is that it's very likely, if we're the importer, that the vendors we work with, we're not their only customer. They're making similar, if not identical, products for our competitors. That's an important point that'll come back up in just a bit. A very important point is that the vast majority of vendors, especially in Asia, these offshore producers, operate on a build-to-order model. That means they don't have any inventory laying around ready to ship. We as the importer have to place a purchase order on them, provide a down payment before a vendor will lift a finger, and go out and get raw materials and start production. there's no inventory laying around in Asia. That's going to extend what's referred to as cumulative lead times considerably. We'll talk more about that in just a moment as well. Second to the last bullet on this slide, lots of importers deal with seasonality. Summertime, back to school, the holiday season, where 60, 70, 75% of the sales of a given company, of a given importer, are going to happen in a very short period of time. So we as the importers have to strike while the iron's hot, and that sometimes compels us to buy more than we need. To that point, another interesting characteristic of an import supply chain is that MOQs, that stands for minimum order quantity, or quantity discounts, might compel importers to buy more than they need from their overseas vendors. Our demand signals might tell us that we need 5,000 items, but the minimum order quantity from a vendor is 7,500. We can't buy 5,000. It's a minimum order quantity of 7,500. Or if we buy 10,000, the price per unit goes from $5 to $4. That's very tempting from a financial perspective, from a unit cost perspective, from a total cost of ownership viewpoint and a bullwhip effect viewpoint. It can be very damaging to a supply chain. What else? Given this B2O model, build to order model, cumulative lead times are excessively long. If you've not heard the term cumulative lead time, it is really, really important in any business model, but definitely in a build to order import model. Essentially, cumulative lead time is the amount of days that go by from the moment the importer recognizes a need for more product, until that need is fulfilled, until they get that product. And in today's world, that can be 180 days. It can be even longer. Cumulative lead time is a super critical component, especially if they become destabilized due to backlogs at ports, blank sailings, all the things we've seen in the pandemic era. We're going to come back to cumulative lead time again, but let's just say this: for every product that you import, if you want to at least try and avoid the bullwhip effect, you have to know and measure what your cumulative lead times are. From the time you place a purchase order on a vendor until you get it and it's in a position to be sold. The point is that a great deal of time transpires from the receipt of a demand signal, people are buying stuff online like crazy, to meeting that demand. And when cumulative lead time is 120 days on its best day, but more likely to be 180, even longer days, that's problematic and can create the bullwhip effect. Initial demand signals, moving on to our second bullet point, compel companies to place additional POs on overseas vendors. That means there might be high demand for a product like our craft beer, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that high demand is going to continue. So based on initial demand signals, our own optimism compels us to place additional POs on these overseas vendors, and by the time we get the stuff, you know what happens. Here's what else happens. Because we're outsourcing our production, and the companies that do our manufacturing for us are likely working with other companies, almost guaranteed to be working with other companies, competitors will react in kind. Every importer has competitors, and secrets are hard to keep. So if initial demand goes up and everybody responds in that particular industry, it's going to put more pressure, just like we saw in the beer game, on the manufacturers. As such, production and or shipping delays ensue, and then product arrives late, after it's needed, and or the demand diminishes. Import supply chains are based on flow, the assumption that goods are going to flow and that demand will be relatively stable. However, certainly in the pandemic world, and depending on the business model a company's in, it doesn't always work that way. So supply chain disruption can cause the bullwhip effect as well. And it's just a back and forth of these feedback loops, vicious cycles in this instance, that continuously lead us to experience, in our example, bloated inventories. Let's take a visual look at what we're explaining here. Why importers or I should say why import supply chains are susceptible to the bullwhip effect. This is a pretty boiled down supply chain. We'll use the example of an importer of gas grills and accessories. Excuse me. But this is a boiled down version. This doesn't represent all of the players in a supply chain. They wouldn't fit in a discernible fashion on the slide. For example, we left out origin customs in China, let's say, or a company that provides pre-inspection product testing or pre-shipment product testing, banks that are engaged in letters of credit, cargo insurance companies. These aren't all the players. So by virtue of the fact that there are so many players, starting with the importer HQ, an importer of gas grills and accessories, who has its own internal goings on between sourcing, between sales, between the sales forecasting people, but also all of the goings on, all of the feedback loops that exist across the supply chain. It's just fertile ground for things to get amplified. Now, I chose the example of gas grills because I had this experience myself. Now, it's a sample size of 1, I'll admit that, but I think it's indicative of how the bullwhip effect can happen in a supply chain. Back in March of 2020, I'll admit, I was going to buy a new gas grill anyway, so it wasn't this me anticipating the bullwhip effect and product shortages and product gluts and what have you. I needed a new grill anyway. But what seemed to happen, because I was paying attention to this stuff, is that back in March, demand for everything kind of plummeted, with the exception of hand sanitizer and toilet paper, but people stopped buying stuff. But then a little bit of time goes by and the lockdowns were in place and people couldn't go out anymore and spend money going to the movies or on vacations or out to restaurants and such. So they had, it seems, had additional disposable income laying around. So what do? Online retail therapy, getting deliveries every day from Amazon. In my instance, in the case of a gas grill. So demand goes up. But the point is this: the cumulative lead time for gas grills in an outsourced manufacturing environment, let's say it's 150 days to be generous. So March, April comes around, people start buying stuff online, they start buying do-it-yourself project stuff, gas grills, whatever the case may be. So demand starts to spike. And our importer, by the way, sells online as well as through stores like the Home Depot, like Lowe's, etc. And everybody knows when you work with those companies, you better have product availability. So there's immediate pressure to always have perhaps more inventory than you really need. So we have a spike in demand. There's a 150-day cumulative lead time. Most barbecuing under normal circumstances happens in the summertime. So some months go by. These vendors that make gas grills, they're not making just gas grills for us. They're making gas grills and accessories for other people too. So they start to experience backlogs, just like in the beer game. Gluts in shipping. We all know the story at the origin terminals, the destination, ocean port terminals, blanked sailings, crazy ocean freight rates. That really doesn't help much. So the goods, the gas grills actually start showing up in September, in October. Now, I'm from Massachusetts. I'm broadcasting from California, but I'm from the great state of Massachusetts. So I know what it means to be grilling in October, November, December, freezing your behind off on your back porch. That will diminish the demand for gas grills. Now, in the western parts of the United States, California, of course, we can grill all year. That's a different story. But the point remains salient. Demand goes down due to seasonality, even during a pandemic, and there's more gas grills in the supply chain than are needed. So the nature of the model itself, outsourced manufacturing, build to order, no inventory laying around, all of these different players and the interactions that go on internally at the importer and externally with all of these players create a scenario where demand signals can easily get amplified. Throw in the surges and lulls from the pandemic, and that's how the trouble starts. That's why import supply chains are susceptible to the bullwhip effect. All righty, let's start to wrap this story up. So what can we do about this. Best practices to avoid bloated import inventories. And we'll note here that in the spirit of systems thinking, we don't present supply chains in a linear fashion like we saw previously. It's a circular fashion where sensitivity to demand is at the center of the exercise here. Again, study this up in that 58-minute video on systems thinking and supply chain management. For now, let's say, if you don't do this already, you're an importer and you don't do this already, engage in formal and ongoing sales and operations planning activities. If you're not familiar with S&OP, as it's called, really, it's a monthly, weekly, and oftentimes daily meeting between multifunctional executives within an organization, and their job is to constantly compare forecasted to actual sales and make adjustments accordingly. Is a product selling really well? Do we need to get more? Or do we really need to get more? Is a product selling poorly? Do we need to back off of acquiring more product? These are teams within an organization, from sourcing, from purchasing, from sales, from merchandising, from IT, from logistics, that are looking at every single item, what was forecasted to be sold, what was actually sold, and how do we make adjustments to those variations between forecasted and actual demand. This alone will help us at least try to avoid the Bullwhip effect, because we're all cognizant of it and taking measures to avoid it. The point of cumulative lead time, the amount of time that goes by from the moment a need is recognized, a purchase order is placed by the importer on a factory overseas, until that merchandise gets into a place in a store or in a DC where it can be fulfilled online. That's cumulative lead time. Can be 150, as we said, 180, minimum 180 days. A lot can happen. And the bullwhip effect can be quite nefarious and have some quite damaging effects on our supply chain during that time period. Know and measure the cumulative lead time for every item that you import. What's the production time? What's the transportation lead time? If it's going on the rail from LA Long Beach to a DC in Chicago, what's the time there? And in the world of pandemic-driven delays across the supply chain, would best be making adjustments to cumulative lead time, because if we're not, we're in big trouble. Invest in supply chain visibility technology. There's lots of great tools out there. Some are really expensive, but you can cobble together, if you want to get creative enough, and we at TFI know how to do this, you can create some pretty economical visibility tools to answer the all-important question of import supply chain. Where's my stuff? When am I going to get it? And what's it going to cost me? You can't manage in the dark. And then finally, adopt a systems thinking approach to supply chain management, where we're questioning assumptions. We're looking for constraints. We're identifying feedback loops that influence the behavior of the supply chain and the outcomes, to hopefully at least try to proactively avoid the bullwhip effect. All righty, that's it. That was fairly painless, 10 slides. This video was recorded in early July 2021. So we'll say thank you, stay safe, and enjoy your summer. And for those gringos on the line, for the Americans tuning in, happy early 4th of July. What we'll also say is, you're watching this video via the Trade Facilitators YouTube channel. Be sure to check out all of the trade-related training videos available for free, no registration, no nothing, on the TFI YouTube channel. There's a great one on sales and operations planning. There's the one that I spoke of on systems thinking. And also, again, feel free to download this paper on systems thinking, because it will help you in your supply chain endeavors. That is available on the Trade Facilitators website. And if you'd like to contact me directly, my name's Dan Gardner. I'm president of Trade Facilitators Incorporated. You can reach me here. Thank you very much.